In December 2009, a science fiction film called Avatar opened in theaters and changed how the world thought about three-dimensional entertainment. Audiences strapped on plastic glasses and watched an alien jungle seem to float off the screen and into the room. The film became one of the highest-grossing movies ever made, and a large share of its ticket sales came from theaters charging extra for the 3D format. Studio executives and electronics makers watched the box office numbers and drew the same conclusion. If people would pay a premium to see 3D in a cinema, they would pay a premium to bring it home. That single assumption launched an entire consumer product category and buried it within about half a decade. At the Consumer Electronics Show in January 2010, 3D television was everywhere. Samsung, Sony, Panasonic, and LG each unveiled flagship 3D television lineups, positioning the technology as the next mandatory upgrade after high definition. Trade press called it the future of the living room. Retailers built glowing showroom displays where families lined up to try on glasses and watch demo reels of leaping fish and swooping camera shots designed to show off the depth effect at its most dramatic. Analysts predicted that within a few years, 3D capability would be a standard feature on nearly every mid-range and premium television sold, and manufacturers repeated that prediction publicly, treating 3D as an inevitability rather than an experiment. Manufacturers poured research budgets, marketing spending, and shelf space into the format, betting that consumers were ready for the next leap forward, the same way they had embraced color television decades earlier and high-definition television more recently. Trade shows in the following 2 years featured dozens of competing 3D models across nearly every screen size, and television makers openly discussed plans to eventually make 3D capability standard on almost all televisions, not just premium flagship models, treating it as the natural successor to high definition rather than a niche add-on. The core promise was simple: recreate the immersive depth of a movie theater on the screen in a customer's living room. But the technology needed to deliver that illusion came with a catch that theatrical 3D never fully solved. Either special glasses were required, and at home, that requirement became a much bigger problem. Two competing formats emerged. Active shutter glasses used small batteries and tiny electronic shutters that alternated, blocking each eye many times per second, synchronized wirelessly with the screen. They produced sharper images but were heavy, expensive, and needed regular charging or battery replacement. A single pair often cost more than $100, and outfitting a family of 4 for movie night could add several $100s on top of the price of the television itself. Passive glasses, similar to the disposable ones used in theaters, were far cheaper and lighter, but they worked by splitting the screen's resolution between each eye, producing a noticeably softer, lower-quality image. Consumers who bought into one format often discovered their glasses were not compatible with a different manufacturer's television, locking them into a single brand for years. Cost stacked on cost. A 3D-capable television commanded a significant premium over an equivalent 2D model. Watching 3D content properly typically required a compatible 3D Blu-ray player and a 3D mastered Blu-ray disc, both sold at premium prices themselves. By the time a household had purchased the television, the player, extra glasses for multiple viewers, and a handful of discs, the 3D experience often cost hundreds of dollars more than simply buying a very good regular television. For many families, that premium bought a novelty they used a handful of times before it gathered dust. Even for households willing to pay, there was strikingly little to actually watch. Hollywood released only a limited number of major 3D films to home video each year, and native 3D television broadcasts were even scarcer. Sports networks tried to fill the gap. ESPN launched a dedicated 3D channel in June 2010, timed to coincide with the World Cup, hoping live sports would showcase the technology at its best. A separate 3D channel, backed jointly by a major cable programmer, a Japanese electronics company, and a large-format film company, launched the following year with a similar bet on nature documentaries and event programming. Direct broadcast satellite providers and cable operators in several countries launched similar 3D channels and on-demand offerings around the same period, including a dedicated 3D channel from a British satellite broadcaster. But 3 years later, in mid-2013, ESPN announced it was shutting its 3D channel down, citing what the network described as low adoption of 3D television sets in American homes and insufficient viewer interest to justify continued production costs. The other major 3D channels folded within roughly the same window, one after another, citing nearly identical reasons. Other broadcasters that had launched 3D services, including a pay television provider in Australia, made the same decision around the same time. closing their 3D channels for nearly identical reasons. The content simply never arrived in the volume that would have made owning the hardware worthwhile, and once the handful of channels carrying it disappeared, even 3D-capable owners had almost nothing native to watch, beyond the occasional Blu-ray disc. Beyond cost and content, the viewing experience itself worked against the technology. 3D television required viewers to sit within a fairly narrow sweet spot, roughly centered in front of the screen, and within a specific viewing angle, for the illusion of depth to render correctly. Sit too far to one side, and the effect degraded or broke apart entirely. That constraint clashed directly with how households actually used their living rooms, where people sat at odd angles, moved around, or watched from a kitchen or a hallway. A technology that only worked from one exact seat on the couch was a difficult sell to a family that wanted to sprawl out and relax. Physical discomfort turned out to be an even bigger obstacle. A meaningful share of viewers reported eye strain, headaches, dizziness, and general fatigue after extended 3D viewing sessions, particularly with active shutter glasses, whose rapid flickering could be tiring on the eyes over time. Some optometrists and pediatric health organizations advised caution around prolonged 3D viewing for young children, whose visual systems were still developing, which further discouraged family use of the format precisely in the households that had been targeted as core buyers. People who wore prescription glasses often found the added 3D eyewear uncomfortable to stack on top of their own frames, and large family groups often had to share a small number of glasses, turning a supposedly communal activity like movie night into a logistical chore of who got to watch in 3 dimensions and who did not. What was marketed as a spectacular, immersive experience often felt, in practice, like a mild physical ordeal that undercut the relaxation people expected from watching television. Video game makers experimented with the format too, hoping interactive entertainment might succeed where movies and sports struggled. Sony added 3D support to its PlayStation console through a software update, and a handful of major game publishers released 3D-compatible titles as a bonus feature rather than a headline selling point. But the format demanded the same narrow seating position and the same glasses that were already frustrating movie viewers, and few players found that crouching motionless in one exact spot on the couch, glasses on, improved a fast-moving action game enough to justify the hassle. Game studios quietly stopped highlighting 3D compatibility within a couple of years, treating it as a checkbox feature rather than something players actually asked for. Consumer research from the period captured the mismatch clearly. Surveys conducted around 2012 found that a majority of respondents, more than 60% in some polls, said there simply was not enough 3D content available to justify owning the hardware, while more than half separately reported dissatisfaction with the quality of the 3D image itself. In other words, the people who had actually bought 3D televisions were, in large numbers, unhappy customers rather than enthusiastic evangelists. Word of mouth, historically the most powerful driver of consumer electronics adoption, worked against the category instead of for it. For a few years, the sales numbers still looked encouraging on paper, because 3D capability was increasingly bundled into higher-end televisions almost automatically. Whether or not shoppers cared about the feature, shipments of 3D-capable television sets climbed sharply between 2010 and 2012. But that statistic was misleading. Most owners of 3D-capable sets used the plain 2D picture the overwhelming majority of the time, and industry surveys repeatedly found that only a small fraction of owners used the 3D function regularly, if they had ever used it at all. The technology was present in millions of living rooms without ever becoming a habit in most of them. Around 2013, a new industry priority arrived that offered manufacturers a far easier story to sell: ultra-high-definition resolution, commonly branded 4K. Unlike 3D, a 4K television delivered a visible, glasses-free improvement the instant a customer turned it on, with no special eyewear, no compatibility issues, and no complaints about headaches. Every major manufacturer redirected its research and marketing budget toward 4K, and soon after, high dynamic range picture technology, both of which improved literally everything a viewer already watched, rather than requiring an entirely separate content ecosystem. Television makers found it far simpler to convince a shopper to pay more for a screen that made regular programs look sharper than to keep explaining why a customer needed extra glasses to watch a shrinking library of niche content. The retreat from 3D happened quietly, without a single dramatic announcement, more like a technology fading out of price lists one model year at a time. Vizio, a major American television brand, dropped 3D features from its lineups in 2014. Samsung, one of the format's original champions, stopped including 3D compatibility in its new television models starting in 2016. Sony and LG followed close behind, phasing the feature out of their new lineups by around 2017, effectively ending mainstream 3D television production entirely. Within roughly 7 years of its triumphant unveiling at that Consumer Electronics Show, 3D television had gone from the headline feature of every major manufacturer's product line to a specification nobody bothered to advertise, and then to a feature that no longer existed in new products at all. Looking back, the failure of 3D television is not really a story about one bad idea, so much as a case study in mistaking a spectacle for a habit. The film industry's 3D success at the cinema relied on a controlled, one-time, novelty environment. A dark room, a captive audience, a single sitting of a couple of hours, and a premium ticket price people were willing to pay occasionally for an event. Manufacturers assumed that same enthusiasm would transfer intact into the home, where television is watched constantly, casually, in ordinary clothes, from odd angles, often with children present, and almost always without any appetite for extra equipment or physical discomfort. The format asked customers to change fundamental habits, put on glasses, sit in one exact spot, seek out scarce content in exchange for a feature many ultimately did not want badly enough to keep using. The broader lesson echoed through the electronics industry for years afterward. Features that require a customer to do extra work, adapt their behavior, or tolerate physical discomfort tend to struggle in the mass market, no matter how impressive they look in a showroom demonstration. 4K and high dynamic range succeeded, where 3D failed precisely because they demanded nothing extra from the viewer at all. Industry analysts later pointed to 3D television as a textbook example of a technology push, rather than a consumer pull, a feature that manufacturers wanted to sell far more than shoppers ever wanted to buy, driven by boardroom excitement about margins on premium hardware, rather than by any groundswell of household demand. It was not the first time consumer electronics had chased a format that ultimately went nowhere, and it would not be the last. But the speed of the reversal was unusual. An entire product category went from headline launch to industry-wide abandonment in under a decade, a shorter lifespan than almost any other major television feature before or since. 3D television is remembered today less as a failed piece of hardware and more as a reminder that novelty and genuine, lasting value are not the same thing, and that an industry chasing the excitement of a blockbuster film had, in the end, built a product that most living rooms simply did not need. The glasses are mostly gone from stores now, the dedicated channels have long since closed, and the television sets that once advertised 3D compatibility as their headline feature quietly sold their last units years ago. What remains is a case study that other industries have studied since. A spectacular demo is not the same thing as a habit worth keeping, and asking a customer to change how they sit, what they wear, and what they watch is a much harder sale than simply making the picture on the screen look better than it did the year before.